determine the number of polling sites that we generally have. So it's currently our practice in the calendar committees that Ms. Tamani Anderson-Powell, she runs. We have multiple committees based on the calendar type. During a national election, we generally try to make a teacher workday on election day. The committee does consider a workday on other years and will do so if possible. But as you've known from the conversations we've had recently, it's very hard to manage the teacher workdays, the bank days, and fit it all into the calendar based on the calendar law. But they do their best to fit it all in. So options for November 8th. We have 3 options to share with you, and I'll walk you through them. Option 1 would be to move an existing teacher workday from another date on the calendar. Okay, so on the traditional calendar, we would look at moving.
Glenn, hang on just one second. So
sorry.
There's no presentation loaded in Assembly. Is that correct? Yeah, it's not in Assembly.
Loaded in Assembly? I'm
sorry.
So
I just want you to be aware of that as you're going through the slides up there for now, and then we need to make sure that we get that loaded.
Okay. On November 4th, which is a traditional workday, moving that to November 8th. Okay. And then on the modified calendar, moving May 26th, which is a teacher workday, to November 8th. But this would also require moving the last day of school. So instead of the last day of school being May 25th, we would need to push that out to the 26th in order to accommodate the number of days needed of instruction. Okay? And then on the year-round calendar, including single track 4, moving the October 24th teacher workday to November 8th. Continued with option 1, moving a teacher workday. Early colleges, and those early colleges associated with Wake Tech, so that's Knightdale High School, North Wake College and Career Academy, Vernon Malone, Wake Early College Health Sciences, and Wake Early College of Information and Biotechnologies, those schools associated with Wake Tech. We would be moving their teacher workday from the 24th to November 8th. This would also incorporate them needing to move their last day of school from the 23rd of May to the 24th. The leadership academies, men's and women's, that would incorporate them moving from November 4th to November 8th. And then Wake STEM moving their January 4th teacher workday to November 8th. Those are all of option 1. So items to consider with option 1. Obviously, this will negatively impact the letters training. We've worked very hard to put those teacher workdays in a way so that teachers can work on those particular components of that training. It's also part of the early release days. I think it's about 1/8 of our teachers would actually have to find time to do the letters training on their own time, as opposed to everyone else who would get it during the teacher workdays. So there's an inequity there.
Why would that not shift?
Say again?
Why would that not shift days? If we switch work days, why would the training days just not shift along with it?
And here comes Drew.
That's why we brought Dr. Cook.
Yes, sir, Dr. Martin. So the short answer is because the schedule is so tight with letters and their capacity to provide training, they're unable to adjust the schedule, and nor does the district have the capacity to offer training on a full day later in the calendar. So I think roughly 23 schools and 1,200 teachers. And so it's a logistical issue in terms of planning and their commitments to other districts across the entire state that are also simultaneously providing the training.
Okay, so this is a personnel and space issue.
It's a capacity issue
Yeah.
to deliver the training on a date other than one that's been planned for 6
Yeah.
months.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. So if you go with option 1, you'd be looking at a school week of Monday, children having school, Tuesday, which would be election day, where they'd have no school, Wednesday, they'd go back to school, Thursday would be an early release day, and Friday would be no school, which is Veterans Day. So that's a calendar that's, kind of broken up. Previously, the students were going to school Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, had an early release on Thursday, and no school on Friday. So parents would need to find care for their children on the Tuesday of that week as well. And then changing the teacher workday for students will impact families, staff, all the above. So just considering all of those options. Option 2, moving vacation or track out days. So for track 1, we would suggest moving November 23rd to November 8th. The traditional calendar, modified, and early colleges, all the same day, taking the November 23rd date and moving it to November 8th. So this would be a no-school day for students and staff. Option 2 continued. Track 4 would move November 23rd.
Glenn,
Say again.
just for a point of clarification, is November 23rd the Tuesday?
The Wednesday
The
before
Wednesday
Thanksgiving.
prior to Thanksgiving,
Yes.
the day before Thanksgiving. I just want to make
Thank
sure
you for
that.
clarifying.
Thank you.
Yes, that is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So and I'll talk a little bit more, but as we looked at this option of moving days that you can actually move vacation days, you are very limited. It's either the day before Thanksgiving or one of the bookends on the Christmas holiday, because a lot of your other holidays are based to a natural holiday. So you don't really have that day to take off. Track 4 would move November 23rd, that Wednesday, to November 8th. And then also make April 24th a teacher workday, which is currently an in-school day for track 4 only, but they're the only track that's in on that particular day. And that just was a scheduling issue with fitting in the number of days. Track 2 would move February 15th to November 8th. So students would have school on February 15th, but not have school on November 23rd, which would be a flip-flop of days. You're tracking in and tracking out, so they're just staying tracked in for an extra day, whereas track 3 then would then lose a day to make up for that. So make February 15th a track out day, and the students would not have school on November 23rd, and that would be in order to balance the number of days for the school year for those students. So items to consider for option 2. It will not impact letters training. The school week will be the same as if we had option 1, school on Monday, no school on Tuesday, school on Wednesday, early release Thursday, no school on Friday. Changing the vacation track-out dates for students will impact families. Again, November 23rd, which is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, generally a travel day for families. And if you try to change that to one of the bookends of Christmas, you're looking at the Thursday before Christmas break, because the Monday coming back is the day after a holiday. So you generally would normally have that off because the holiday falls on a Sunday. So you're looking at having the students only have come into that school week with a Friday off, and then starting that 1 week off for Christmas. So it shortens their week, their Christmas break. And then it'll ensure that all tracks will have the same number of days of school, which is a plus, but there's a lot of moving parts here. And I'll be honest, before we get into the third option, options 1 and 2 are very intrusive. They impact a lot of different moving parts, and so they're not part of our recommendation. So option 3, which is the staff recommendation, which would be to create a calendar track-out day on November 8th. So using a banked day, which we currently have 3 reserved. So using that bank day would mean we'd only have 2 bank days left. But this would be the least impactful in the sense of not having to change days for teacher work days and trainings. And then also allowing families to have the same number of vacation days on the days that they're already set. Okay? So items to consider for option 3. It will not impact letters training. Again, the school week will be the same.
If I can interrupt just a second,
Sure.
it is now loaded in Simply for those listening or at the table if
Thank
you'd
you.
like to see.
Adding the additional calendar track-out days will impact families. It'll be the least intrusive of all options. And then having only 2 bank days will limit our cushion for unexpected weather or other reasons. Okay? So that becomes staff's recommendation for election day, turning it into a calendar out, track-out day, and using a bank day.
Such
Option
an
3 would be
interesting
our
approach,
recommendation.
going with the worst to the better. I've seen that in sales before.
Well, this was a pitch.
All right, and so now for Juneteenth, we'd like to recommend that we move the teacher workday from June 30th to June 19th. So this is a federal holiday. We do not have it in our current calendar as of yet. It would only impact multi-track year-round schools. And so on June 30th, they have a teacher workday as part of their clopening. And so therefore, staff would have professional development, training, meetings those days as they close out one year and start the next. This isn't a very favorable option for year-round principals because they do use that time to get ready for that next school year, so it would limit their prep by one day. They do have a couple days, whether it's 2 to 3 days at the start of the next school year for teacher work days. But if anyone's been in a multi-track year-round calendar school, all days are needed for that clopening as much as possible. So this would move up that last day to June 19th, provide students with a day off for that particular work day, school day, in observance of the holiday. And then what staff could ask from you, the board, is giving us direction moving forward with Election Day and Juneteenth. We can look at future calendars, 23, 24 being the earliest one, and beyond, and start mandating that we have no students in the buildings on these particular days, if you so choose. So that's what staff will also be asking from you as we leave today.
I just want to make sort of a question or clarification with the multi-track year-round and looking at Juneteenth. So is June 30th, how many work days are there for the new school year? June 30th is one of them, or no?
So technically, June 30th is the last day of that particular school year. So they do use it, but remember, new staff wouldn't start until the next day, so there's that.
Because when I look at the 23-24 year-round calendar, is that what we're talking about, 23-24?
No, it'd be 22, 23.
So just, so like,
So the current year.
No, 23, 24 for next year, yes. Juneteenth, if we implement it the end of this year.
okay, that's right. Okay. Just want me, okay, so we're looking at 23-24 technically,
To begin, that's
right? So,
Wait, I'm still, aren't you talking about changing the 22-23 calendar, the coming calendar with respect to addressing Juneteenth?
Correct.
Right.
But
the work days that we're impacting are for the 23-24 school year.
Clopening ends, so the June 30th would be the first day of the teacher work days that they close and open the next school. So
The
they
end
roll
of the
into the next
22,
school
23 year.
It's the closening.
It's the clopening day.
Is the clopening, right?
Clopening's in
And so
another.
I think what I'm trying to point out, if I am correct, is the clopening between June 23 and July 23 includes a total of 2 teacher work days,
I'm not looking,
and we're taking away one of them.
I'm not looking at it.
And, well, the reason I'm looking at that is because I'm sitting here looking at the 23-24 year-round calendar, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday are orange. I don't know if that's correct. Those are vacation days.
You're looking at a student calendar,
Okay.
right? You're looking at the.
So we don't know what those are teacher, so we need to look at the employee calendar. Got it. Yeah.
So, but likely those will be, all the orange days are teacher work days.
Okay.
So I don't know how many, because I'm not looking at it right this second.
Yeah, and then there's July 4th in the middle of that.
Which is a track out day, so 11th and 12th, no, nobody would be working on July 4th.
Okay. Thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure that we had more than just one teacher workday for clopening.
Are we going to
with
look
this
into
change.
that? We're going to check into that, right?
We can get you an answer by the end of today on
Yeah.
that. But also, we'll be bringing this to the board for a vote during the next board meeting. So we'll definitely have that information for you before you vote.
There
Any questions or
other
concerns?
questions from board members?
I would just ask if we have alignment around option 3 for the first scenario,
Do we?
election day, and then ensuring with the response on how many teacher workdays we actually go from this to this, which would be one less, that clarification with the option presented for Juneteenth day.
Do we have a thumbs up for option 3?
And is this a vacation day or a
The banked day,
bank day? So it would
Yes.
be
inclement weather day.
Is-
Will-
It's essentially a non-day, it's not
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Calendar out or a track out.
Staff and students would not be in school.
Teachers don't have to report to school and students. No school for students or staff.
Correct.
I don't want to answer on behalf of HR. No.
Yes, I think that. just putting safety concerns, I think that is a very good option because of just what is anticipated around those 70 schools that serve as our polling sites. And I appreciate that Mr. Carrozza noted that the Board of Elections has the right to, I won't say commandeer our schools, but to hold any of our schools as a polling place. They can cite the polling place at any of our schools. That's in state statute. So thank you for underscoring that. That's why we have 70. Thank you.
Tamani?
Okay, so I pulled up the 23-24 year-round calendar, and I see the orange days are July 3rd, the 4th would not be a day, July 5th, the 6th is already identified as the teacher workday, the 7th, and then the 10th. So any of the orange days except July 4th would likely be a teacher workday.
Thank you.
Staff calendar has not been confirmed, but
Okay.
likely those
Okay.
will be
I just want to make sure we had enough teacher work days at the beginning, so thank you.
I think this just shows the beauty of that calendar law is the gift that keeps on giving. And noting that there are multiple local bills just sitting, waiting for that calendar to get changed. That's all. No, we're not talking about it anymore. No. All right, so we have a thumbs up for option 3. I think we have some consensus around our year-round and track 4 calendars in regards to June 19th. Any further questions or comments from board members? Okay.
Can I
Yes,
just
ma'am.
clarify about getting direction moving forward with our calendars
Yes.
for these particular days?
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
Start us
on that, particularly for moving forward, I mean, we get this concern about Election Day over and over again. I think it would be, rather than having to come back to it later, I think it'd be better to just put it into our planning structure. In terms of Juneteenth, it is a federal holiday now, and I think we should recognize it. It's not only because it's federal, but it really is a significant holiday for our country, so I think we should recognize it.
And not just a federal holiday, but one adopted by our county and many municipalities across this county.
Exactly.
So, Mr. Haggerty, did you have your hand up?
Only from the point of view that I agreed that this is something we should put either in policy or just part of our regular process when we begin the calendar work each year. And it might even be something that, I know we have a limited amount of space in our legislative agenda, but we should ask the state, about making this a state holiday, for or exempt on the school calendar law, because again, if we have limited number of instructional days, and this is something that we continue to receive direction from state and county officials that they want to use our schools as polling places, but they'd prefer we not have school, let's just recognize it as a holiday or a day when there is no school and move on from there. An election day, yeah.
Ms. Kushner?
I mean, as to Juneteenth, I agree it's important to recognize, but we also have other federal holidays that we don't have as vacation days, so having them as work days around President's Day, Indigenous People, or Columbus Day. The federal government calls it Columbus Day. So there are federal holidays that we do have as work days, so I think we should remember to keep that as some of our, as an option for some of these holidays that are federally mandated.
Further questions, comments?
If I
Yes,
just
sir.
may, to your point, which is absolutely appropriate, I think one of the things that we also should think about is not just a day off, but let's think about education surrounding the holiday. Whether it's Juneteenth, whether it's President's Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, these shouldn't just be a day off. They really should be a time where we actually pay attention to what it is that the holiday is about.
All right. Ms. Johnson-Hustler.
While I don't completely disagree, I don't think it's the same. It is a federal holiday that sits in the summer that only impacts one calendar. So while we certainly should be teaching these things and making it a part of education and acknowledging we don't give other federal holidays as days off, this is distinct and different. It is the only one that I'm aware of that impacts one calendar. So I don't think it can be or should be treated the same.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, we are moving on to our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline, Part 3, joined by Mr. Paul Coe and Dr. Paul Walker. And this is a follow-up presentation from the April 20th Student Achievement Committee.
We will begin. Good afternoon, Chair Mahaffey, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Today we're bringing you, as Ms. Mahaffey said, the third part of our presentation about the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline, and I'm going to be presenting with Dr. Paul Walker. We also have Drew Cook and Dr. Will Chavis in the wings, and I believe we're also joined virtually by Kathy Shantos in case there are questions for any of the three. And so for our desired outcomes, through today's sessions, we wanted to provide a quick review of our Part 2 presentation back in June, where Mr. Cook, Dr. Chavis, along with our principals Catherine Hutchinson, Nolan Bryant, and our ALC teacher Elizabeth Hinman, presented some key points essential to our work as a district in our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. With that context, we hope that by the end of this presentation, we provide a reminder of the increased student needs we've seen throughout the pandemic. We also wanted to reiterate the connections between the academic and behavioral health elements of our work as it relates to the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. And lastly, we wanted to provide an overview of data connected to student discipline and the overarching work of our comprehensive plan. And we just wanted to note that the data we present will combine both the most available data from the 2020-2021 school year, along with some of our historical data leading up to our last non-pandemic year in 2018-19. And we present this data not only to share the positive, but to share snapshots of what we've seen within our district that point to the work and improvements we have before us. And this slide is just a reminder of what we've noted before, that the needs of our students, ranging from basic needs to the academic, mental health, SEL, and behavior supports, have all intensified throughout the pandemic. And it's important within our work of our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline to ensure the work of our district uses this holistic picture of what our students or families are going through, and that we support the work of our schools from the district level through this wider frame. And we know you've seen this slide many times, and we just wanted to provide a quick reminder again about our work as it relates to the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline as a long-term, multi-year challenge, one that in many instances will require us to rethink, reimagine, and redesign the way that teaching and learning occurs for students across our district. And in this next slide, we wanted to add an additional frame as another reminder that part of our work through the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline is about the nexus of academics and behavioral health. And behavioral health serves as a foundation for achieving academic goals, while academic instruction also provides an opportunity for teaching and practicing behavioral health. And these two are interdependent, and we cannot teach these in silos. And it's imperative that we're ensuring that behavioral health is woven throughout the academic instructional time to support and deepen learning. And as we've mentioned several times in previous presentation, the next phase of delivery of quality instruction and strong support services for our students is going to require several years to achieve through a framework of systems and structures, and ranging from a pre-K-12 comprehensive balanced assessment system to high-quality instruction and tiered supports, resource allocation and funding to evaluation and improvement cycles. Our work within the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Discipline is part of our commitment to support the pace of recovering and completing unfinished learning for all of our students. And in these next two slides, we wanted to highlight the importance of ensuring equity is a key focus of our work in our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. As Dr. Chavis mentioned in our June presentation, the culturally responsive framework is a three-pronged approach in addressing inequity and disproportionality. It asks us to see inequities within our academic achievement, understand inequity by developing and maintaining our cultural awareness and integrity, and also to interrupt inequity through our own critical consciousness. From the culturally responsive framework, our Office of Equity Affairs supports schools in seeing, understanding, and interrupting inequity, specifically through the practices shown on this slide, through family and community engagement, education, school support, and coaching and leadership. And in these next 3 slides, I will not be representing the points of our wonderful school-based staff, rather offer a quick reminder of their key points from our presentation in June. Elizabeth Hinman, our ALC teacher at Wake Forest, shared with us the purpose of Alternative Learning Centers. She shared that the work starts with the question, how can I help? And emphasized that offering help instead of punishment, relationship instead of isolation is what the Alternative Learning Center does for students in Wake County Public Schools. And Catherine Hutchinson from Centennial Campus Magnet Middle School shared how much her and her staff focus on relationship building, and through focusing on approaches such as restorative practices and the community resiliency model have helped Centennial work with students in a supportive way, even when things get challenging. And lastly, Nolan Bryant from Cary High School shared with the work he and his staff do to ensure students have access to support with staff and each other, and ensure there is intentional relationship building with students, and that expectations and consequences are made clear for all students. And so with those reminders from our June presentation, I'll now pass it to Dr. Walker, who will present some of our data as it relates to our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Coe, and good afternoon, board members, Superintendent Moore. So the following information that I want to share, it's a broad overview around data, out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, Alternative Learning Center. So let's start with looking at this 2021 school year data. Now, this is based on the approved consolidated report for suspensions compiled by the NCDPI. So similar to what I shared in 1920, here's the disclaimer, right, that the suspension data, this cannot be used for comparisons. So due to the pandemic, we know that most students were not in the building, therefore they were not subject to an out-of-school suspension as we know it. Nevertheless, it's still necessary to share this data as a reference. And also, we have provided this disaggregated, detailed version of this data for your reference that shows more by gender, by school. Overall, I want to highlight that we see that 524 students made up about 644 suspensions during that time. And you'll hear that number again. So since we are not comparing other years with this data, let's just look at other districts at this point to see how comparable our numbers are for this 2021 school year. So I want to highlight as well that this is for the 2021 school year. And so each year, I provide these comparisons for other school systems in our state. And even though this data, again, is not ideal for comparisons, this 2021 data, we still need you to be aware. Of course, this is a small sample of districts, though the consolidated report provides all the OSS data for each district. This data shows that all districts during school closures had far lower suspension counts than they would have in a normal year, especially if we look at a school that is one of our most, or district that is one of our most comparable, Charlotte-Mecklenburg. You see had 777 compared to our 642. And so since we're not taking, again, a deep dive into this 2021 data, let us go and take a view, I think, of some historical data of students that are impacted by out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, and perhaps alternative learning centers over the past several years.
So Dr. Walker, that heading should be 2020, 2021?
Yes.
Okay. So
it's
that
2021.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. So we thought it, as I said, would benefit the conversation to provide this 5-year historical view of OSS, ISS, and ALC to give a really broad brush. As we discussed, due to the pandemic, the last years of 1920, and yes, thank you, Ms. Kusher, 2021, right, that's the focus, cannot be used for comparisons. So as Mr. Coe highlighted, let's look at 14-15 through 18-19 to see what things have looked like. So as you'll see here, for that time period, I want to emphasize that about 4% of our student population was impacted by an out-of-school suspension. I want to reiterate that when we see any data around out-of-school suspension, it always involves 4% of our student population. For example, black students have historically accounted for about 55% of suspensions. It's about 9% of that subgroup. This is still within the 4% of the population. I want to highlight in-school suspension, right, which is time out. It could be a particular area or another area. That's about 1% of our student population. Alternative Learning Center, which are in our middle schools and high schools, that's about 4%. So again, broad brush over the past 5 years. So next, let us continue with this overall data count around OSS, ISS, and ALC to look at the 5-year trend. So this information, thank you, provides an overall visual of any particular key trend. So this data is quite indicative of implementation dips and highs, as well as introduction of new policy that impacted perhaps programmatic options, decisions. It could be a litany of things. The data also was impacted by a renewed focus on equitable discipline practices in around the 2016-2017 school year, and by my office working to create the suspensions by race data that all schools can view. In November of 2018, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, you remember, we went into the OCR resolution agreement that we signed as when you were chair. We signed that 3-year resolution agreement with the Office of Civil Rights, which required more focus on limiting exclusionary practices and closing the gap of disproportionality. So in short, we could use the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline practices really as a blueprint, because I don't want you to forget what we discussed in CPED 2 and CPED 1, to show the variety of strategic tasks, including the information shared by everyone previously, to clarify this data trend. So next, let's look at some data regarding a student group that we look at closely often regarding suspensions, and that's students in need of special education with an individual education program. Good. So this information provides a few key data points. Remember, for comparisons, we are using data really through the 14-15, 18-19 school year. So you have the columns here. So first we have the column which you can see total students suspended. So we have the generic information in the first column. It clarifies about how many students were subject to suspension. So if you've already done some quick calculations, you could see through that number, it's about 6,700 students per year that we have there. So in the third column, it's another kind of generic information that clarifies what is the percentage of students in our overall student population that has an IEP. So for example, you can see that it's about 13% of students historically have an IEP. One of the main purposes about students with an IEP suspended, you really focus on the second and fourth column. So you see really on average, right, the percent of students, that last column, the percent of students suspended with an IEP, and this is historically, again, over 5 years, it accounts for about 1/3 of all students suspended, right, have an IEP, okay? So we can now look at this topic of perhaps recidivism. We're going to touch on this. It's a sample of recidivism. So let's look at that. So,
Excuse me, Dr. Walker, before you go on.
Please, Mr. Haggard.
Would you mind, just on that slide, one of the figures had an asterisk beside it?
Yes.
Could you explain that again?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a one particular year that the overall population compared with the number that we weren't able to determine whether it was like a 12.4 or 12.7. And so that was more of an asterisk for myself to say, I don't know exactly what that was, but it's about 12.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, thank you, Mr. Haggerty. I've talked about this out-of-school suspension data often over the years, so it's clear to you that there is recidivism. So simply put, right, we know that some students have multiple suspensions within any given school year, and this may also progress in many years. So if we use the smaller counts of this data as a sample, 524 students, we know, as we said about the 2021 school data, 524 students accounted for 644 suspensions. So what, of course, does that mean? That means that of those 524 students, some had more than one suspension, right? So this data goes further with providing a great snapshot of the 5-year trend for recidivism. And I suppose there are many aspects you can take into account with this particular data, though we've highlighted a few here. So you see that about 12,262 students had one suspension over this 5-year period. That's what that means. If you take the between 2 and 5 suspensions, you would say about 90% of students had 5 or less suspensions during that time. You see even more focused of higher numbers of about 17 students or so had about 26 to 30 suspensions perhaps over that time. Remember that even though you see about 22,670 students, this is all within, remember, that 4% of the student population over the course of this 5 years. So the last few presentation slide is a representation slides regarding recidivism that we wanted to share with you. So let's start with out-of-school suspension, and then we're also going to see ISS and AOC. So with out-of-school suspension, so this shows, again, the students suspended in 2014-15 with at least one suspension through the 18-19 school year. Remember, this is a really rough glance. It's a sample of what recidivism may look like over these years. This data continually represents that multiple students have multiple suspensions over time. A disclaimer, of course, about this data is that it's influenced by student transition, sometimes out of Wake County Public Schools. Some of these students may have graduated, and other related factors. All of the things you have heard before in the first and second parts of CPED presentation are responses to these recidivism, intervention, multi-tiered system support, alternative learning center, equity teams, restorative practices, community resilience model, special education, behavior support, counseling, psychology, social work, and we could go on, right, about all the opportunities that a lot of these students and schools have to try to keep students in the building, of how you see these numbers through time. And so what you're going to see in the next two slides, again, are quite similar. So you see in-school suspension. In-school suspension, remember, is 1% of our population, but you can see that students in 14-15 with at least one other ISS through the 18-19 school year. Remember, it's a rough glance at what it may look like. And ALC, much smaller numbers, of course, with our alternative learning center. But this shows between 14-15, at least one other ALC through 18-19 school academic year. And remember, ALC is about 4% of our student population. So that's a look at our data. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Paul Coe to remind you perhaps of some next steps.
Right, and Dr. Walker, just to clarify, going back to the data slide on the overall, I think it was slide 15 about the 5-year averages, it's actually ISS represents about 5.4%. And then ALC is about 1%. Okay. Yeah, just to clarify, right? Just so that I know we were reversing. But with that, just additional correction, just wanted to note that before we move on to questions and discussion, we wanted to note some of the next steps in our work with the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. The first is to collaborate with our Office of Civil Rights about what is our formalized need to continue monitoring, right? Do we need to continue submitting reports? Or are they good? We still haven't heard back from them officially yet, but we're working with our attorneys to make sure we get that notice. But I think that's one of the first steps. But regardless of how that goes, we are planning to use the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline to make sure we're monitoring the work that we do in both academic and behavioral health work, intertwined with equity lenses to make sure that we're doing all we can to reduce the disproportionalities that we see within our system. And then secondly, we also wanted to continue the work with district teams to update our new CPED document, right? Instead of us just defining, here's what we do, we want to be collaborative, reach out to our teams, both at the school level and the district level, to make sure that we're capturing what's all the work that encompasses the academic, behavioral, and equity work that is within the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. And thirdly, we wanted to make sure that we set aside a time in the coming years as a routine to share our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline framework with our principals, to make sure that they understand how this is aligned to some of the strategic plan work that we will be doing. And then also we want to expand our data review to include our updated comprehensive plan for equitable discipline framework. I think one note there is that we often have brought the comprehensive plan paired with the discipline data, but going forward, we don't want to just locate discipline data within this report. We want to bring all the holistic data, both academic, behavioral health-wise, qualitative and quantitative, to make sure that you all have a fuller picture of where we're at in terms of our work within the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. And then we want to continue the focus of our work on the nexus of academic and behavioral health and make sure it's aligned to our strategic plan work going forward. So with that overview of our next steps, we'll pause here for any questions and discussion.
Ms. Waters?
Thank you, and thank you for this update. I was just looking at slide 14, where there is a comparison among other districts within the state. Have you any data on comparable cities or districts across the country?
That data is readily available. I don't have it for any particular comment now, but we do have that. We can find that.
Because I think, at least for me, it would be useful to see a comparison among similarly sized districts across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the past, we've looked at, as far as out in California, down in Florida, several districts of that aspect. Yes. Fairfax is huge. Yes. Yeah, so we can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ms. Scott?
Thank you. Could you refresh my memory, inside the physical buildings themselves, is in-school suspension a separate place from alternative learning centers? Or is that often in the same classroom? And
Sure, yeah. In-school suspension is not defined as a place. It's really time out of the regularly assigned class. And so sometimes you may think, oh, elementary doesn't have ISS. Well, it's the concept of time. And so if you're outside the principal's office for 20, 30 minutes, that could look like ISS. And so there are schools that have designated places, whether it's elementary, middle, or high, when it comes to ISS. Alternative learning centers, where we do provide a certified teacher in all middle school and high school to support those particular students that go in ALC. So that is a very specific place in the building.
are students assigned ISS ever placed in the alternative learning center classrooms?
I think that's possible.
Very possible.
It's all three of these are exclusionary discipline practices, which is why all three of them are reported on, because they remove a student from the classroom setting for instruction. But as Dr. Walker is stating, ISS, OSS we're pretty familiar with, that's out of the school. ISS is exclusion from the classroom, but it's not specific to the place. A student might end up in the ALC center because there's supervision there. A student may end up in a conference room next to the principal's office because that's how that you're able to supervise what's going on. The school may have a separate space for ISS. It's up to each school. But ALC is a place that we have asked schools in middle school and high school to provide a location for. But I would assume in many cases that there is commingling of those students.
And thank you for that. And the reason why I asked is just based on the feedback from the teacher that we heard from her experience. And thank you for again highlighting the words, how can I help? It sounded like often alternative learning centers are a place where there's progress happening within those. And I wondered if sometimes you have a student who is going through something pretty intense, if they're suddenly placed into an alternative learning center, if that's disruptive to the progress or what those students within that classroom who have a pretty good thing going, the potential for that to be disrupted. And so if schools don't have a separate place for ISS, students, again, understanding that's a temporary thing, is the reason for that a staffing issue, a space issue, or a funding issue? And again, I'm drawing this from just hearing the one in-person presentation that we had and some feedback that I've just heard during conversations and visits to schools.
Yeah, and Ms. Scott, if I may just add to what you're saying is, I think in terms of that, I guess, differentiation that you're talking about, where ALC can be a place where help, progress, and maybe even centeredness comes for a student that has been struggling a little bit through the support of their ALC teacher. Whereas ISS might be in the moment, to Superintendent Moore's point, we need a separate space for the student out of the classroom. And when you ask, like, is there more staffing or funding or whatnot needed, I think any school might say, yeah, of course, we'll take more people and more funds to support. But I think the thing that we're also trying to do with our comprehensive plan is to widen the lens to beyond just the disciplinary responses. We have to think about what do we do from a core lens, what are the supplemental steps, what are the intensive steps that where ISS is one possible response to actually fully understand what's going on with the student, to make sure that we can do all we can to keep the kid in the classroom as much as possible, or let the student calm down and get back to the classroom as soon as possible. So just know that that's a part of the work too when it comes to the funding, and I think that's what we try to mean by widening our lens about what we need to do with this comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Dr. Coe. I'm absolutely supportive of what you just described. And again, just yes, a yes and situation. Yes, those students absolutely need to be supported, but also just trying to be sensitive to the needs and to the structure and that may have been going on in a classroom of students who we want to be sensitive about why they're there, and that, to begin with as well, and trying to just maintain that peaceful environment that might be happening.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you for the presentation and for including some of the recidivism data. Is something that's I've been hoping to see for a long time. I'd like to offer that this data is somewhat interesting, but I think we can improve a little bit the communication because right now the bubble charts for all three pieces of data that you've given have the same size bubbles for all three, and yet there's a notable differential response. So if you're going to do the bubble charts, I'd scale the bubbles to the size of the value, and that gives you more information, or alternatively, you can just plot it in graphs. You did note, and I think it's important to note, that some of this decrease is because of students moving out of system or graduation or whatnot. So I'd encourage you to run the same analysis for all students. And that way we'd basically see there should be a declining curve, right? If I take all of the 2014-15 students and run those students through the next X number of years, that number is going to decline. So we want to see that declining pattern. That is the normal attrition. And so if the curve that we observe here is above that, that means we have a problem where we have a lot more repeats than what we'd normally, we're normally going to expect a drop-off. What I don't know is this drop-off more or less than what the drop-off I should have expected based on graduation? By just looking at these three pieces of data, however, it is quite interesting that the suspension, and both the out-of-school suspension and the in-school suspension, if you plot those percentages, they almost mirror each other. They'd be where they're in statistical error of each other. But the ALC shows a dramatic drop. So preliminarily, right, we can only speculate right now because we don't have what the curve should normally look like from just normal attrition. But it really looks like this is evidence that the ALC is doing something positive. It's at least doing something positive more so than we can say for the ISS or the out-of-school suspension. Like I say, it'll be interesting to see how does this compare with respect to what the normal attrition will be, and that will tell us, are we getting more of a problem, or are we getting less of a problem, or how much less? So I just think that level of communication will really help us mine this data a little bit more. Already this data is telling us that whatever we're doing in the LCs, it's more effective than what we're doing in suspension or out of school suspension. And I think that points to the intentionality of the ALCs, which is something that we have known, and I think the data is just really reinforcing that. So a good step in the data. I think we can clarify it just a little bit more and show some real value. Related to
Thank
that.
you, Dr. Martin.
Yeah. I actually just took the numbers and plotted them here to look at the graphs because I was curious what they looked like.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for Excel. Somewhat related to that, and we talked about this some in other years, but I'd like to just keep reinforcing that, is right now we're given numbers of suspensions. There was a time where children were suspended because they were not coming to school often enough, right? Truancy. And so to suspend a child for truancy is really counterproductive, right? It does nothing. We've fortunately moved beyond that, right? But let me use that as an extreme, right? To suspend a child for truancy versus to suspend a child because they brought a knife to school, those are two very, very different things. Was a child suspended because of a fight or because of an argument or a cell phone misuse or whatnot? Now, we can't characterize the data too narrowly because then it becomes identifiable. But I really would like us to develop sort of a criteria so that we can look at these suspensions, because I'm going to have a very different response if the suspensions that still exist. I mean, people know that I'm not a big fan of suspension because I think we need a discipline in instead of discipline out. But if we're disciplining out, I can understand disciplining out for a violent offense. I cannot understand disciplining out for sassing a teacher, right? Those are two different things. So I think as I look at the data, I really need to know what are the broad categories. We need to know both in two parts. One, to look at us from a systems perspective to say, what are we doing? What do we need to address? And secondly, I think we need to know that information so we know how to best help the students. Because if we're just looking at raw numbers, what we're going to do to treat a violence issue versus what are we doing to treat, for lack of a better term, an annoyance issue are two very, very different things. So, like I say, the report is important information, but I'd really love us to dig one level deeper. Again, we can't go into to all details, but I believe we could categorize the whys of the suspension. And if we could have like a 4 or 5 sort of broad categories, and even there's an other catch-all category, but I'm really thinking that there's a difference between violence and annoyance and probably somewhere in between. I mean, drug offenses, right? Violence, maybe drug offenses, whatever. But if we could have sort of a scale on that, I really think that would help us make decisions about how do we address this instead of just lumping all numbers into the same pot. So those are just a couple of suggestions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Martin. I think your note about it's essentially trying to at least categorize broadly, like what are the behavioral trends that we see that result in disciplinary consequences that are either out of school suspension or in-school suspension or even things requiring ALC. Yeah.
And also,
I do think that in prior reports and prior years,
Yes.
we did disaggregate to some extent the offenses that were at least the most common because those numbers were larger and therefore less likely to produce student identifiable data.
Yes, we have, and I'll take this as an opportunity to really clarify with schools what we do. We have something called the monthly behavior incident, and this goes and it shows schools using the rule of conduct violations, not only the number and the raw count, but what they are, when it occurred, and disaggregated by race and gender, and it's something that they can look at their school and compare to any other school. So I'm really proud of that work, and that's something that we can also share a sample as well with that. And of course, the suspensions by race as well, they take that and they can compare to that data. And so, yeah, we definitely can provide that clarity.
Okay. Ms. Carter and then Ms. Cash, and then I want to address hands that haven't gone up yet first, and then we'll come back around.
All right. Thank you for this information, and some of what I wanted to hit on has been touched on, so I won't repeat. But I guess, and I know I've said this before, and I know it's been mentioned before in other presentations about looking for alternatives for suspensions. And particularly for me, it is out-of-school suspensions. Yes, in-school suspensions, yes, I want the kids in the classroom, not going to argue. But and I hear violent situations, possibly drug, that folks have concerns about. But for me, I feel like we have learned things and we have put things in place during the pandemic that could be possible choices so that we are not closing the educational door to students, because far too often, once we do, it becomes a cycle. It creates issues. It doesn't build the bridge. It creates a further gap, in my opinion. And I just really urge us to continue to look at ways to put stuff in place so that we are building the bridges and not just saying, all right, you're 14, I'm just making, random thing. 14, you brought a knife to school, you're suspended or expelled, whatever it may be, because I think we're an education system and we need to do our very best to keep them connected to us and educate them versus saying, we're going to semi-close this door, whether it be for 10 days, 20 days, or the rest of the school year, 365, and just hopefully you'll come back to us. Because what are the alternatives to them once we've done that, and to their families? So I know I've said it, but I just really urge to continue to look at that and what can we do to put more things countywide into place so that we are keeping that door wide open. Thank you.
Ms. Carter, thank you for that comment. We just it goes along well with just our pursuit through why we're making sure that the CPED includes the academic and behavioral health elements of our work, that it's not about a misbehavior occurs, so we must only do one thing. It's actually, often we like to say that a misbehavior is the result of many things that have happened before, and we want to try to work with our students as best we can, much like our principals and ALC teacher described, that what are the ways in which we can build connections, relationships with both students and staff, but with each other, so that there can be preventative measures prior to misbehaviors occurring. And should they occur, it's not just you're out of here, right? Whether it's the classroom space or the school space, but kind of like how can I help you, but also, hey, can you tell us what's going on, right? And then figure out what's going on, and then figure out the interventions before it turns into a violent offense or an offense where a school has no choice but to suspend the student. So thank you for that point, and just know that the kind of spirit of this work is trying to move us towards that so that less and less students get suspended over time.
Ms. Cash?
This may be more of a cause and effect than a response, but if it helps one or two children, I'll be glad. But I've heard that from some of the principals that the longest bus rides that our children have, they have the longest wait times at their school. So if they have a long bus ride, they wait at the school in the evening the longest time. If they have a long bus ride in the morning, they get to school, but right at the point where they go right into the classroom, and there's no real de-escalation of arguments from the bus. And some of the neighborhoods bring their arguments from their neighborhoods onto the bus, and then they have a long bus ride for it to escalate. I've understood that some of our principals have done a good job of actually using their ESSER funds to possibly use that time at the end of the day to support these students during that hour and a half wait or hour and 15-minute wait, or some tutoring that they've done, and they're afraid their ESSER funds will go away. And then actually that these students are often the last ones to get to school and walk in late into the classroom because of our bus transportation schedule. So it seems fairly simplistic, but if it helps one or two students do better in school, I wish we would look at that and maybe support the principals that feel like the end of the day where they can address these students before they get on the bus and use that hour and 15 minutes better for emotional support before they get back on the bus for a long ride would be good. I would like to see if we could look at that funding. I know some schools have done a really good job of using their ESSER funds to help in the evening for that long bus ride home.
Thank you for the suggestion, Ms. Cash.
Ms. Johnson-Hustler?
Thank you. I'm glad I went right after you. And I have talked to both of you about this, so I will start at my last place since it makes sense to go after that. And that's going back to our response to any of the things that lead to both in-school suspension, ACL, or out-of-school suspension is our response to de-escalate. We all know that whether it's talking back in subordination for students who get suspended all the way to the most egregious of bringing a weapon to school, it didn't just happen. Right, and so I guess I'm going to continue to push us on how do we start responding to the initial crisis with social and emotional or mental health professionals. We've talked about other districts who have response teams. Mr. Coe, you and I have certainly talked about the school district you came from who had crisis interventions teams in schools. I guess for me, this gap in educational opportunity isn't going to go away unless we start meeting the needs before the crisis. If you talk to any educator or administrator, they're going to give us concrete examples of how they can tell which students they end up needing or deciding to suspend, whether it's any of those three options. They already know what some of those causes are, like bus rides, or we hear it all the time from parents about fights or things that happen at the bus stop because their kids are at the bus stop for 2 hours because the bus is delayed. Or we're bringing in crisis from home, or they get into a class, somebody else is doing something to distract them, and then they're off task. Like, all of us have heard a number of ways. I feel like the answers our educators and administrators can already tell us how to intervene and what points to intervene. I don't think this is a shot in the dark. I think we just have to make a decision to talk to those teachers and administrators on what do you need in place to ensure we decrease student suspension. Is it as a teacher, I know that I teach this level of classes and I have X number. As a teacher, I know I send the most kids to the office. Why? What do I need as the educator? Do I need to know how to de-escalate, set parameters in the class? I don't know, simply get to know the students so that they're less likely to cause problems. I feel like this might be my last year to tell you all one more time that I think we have to address these issues before we get here, or we will continue to close the door on the exact same student population over and over again because we're not actually addressing the need. We've done amazing things, right? I appreciate, you all know I'm a huge fan of the middle school pilot. The things that you have brought to us have been great. We're a large district and we never find the time and space to scale it up. So yes, you can bring me a decrease in numbers, but for me, as a Black woman, those Black students are still at the top of our list of being suspended. I'm going to have to say it every single time because it continues. So even if it drops by 0.1%, that doesn't make me feel better because the gap is still astounding, right? So until there's zero gap, because I think it's possible to have a zero gap. Like, I work in anti-sexual violence. I think it's going to be really hard for me to end rape. I don't think it's really hard for us to close the gap on suspension. I just don't. I think we have to make real decisions and put our money where our mouth is and say we're going to scale these things up. Not easy, but you have all the tools. You all keep bringing us the tools, but we haven't scaled them to the degree that could really impact this in every building. I will say, on the plus side, I will close with the positives of, Dr. Walker, we've talked about the incident report probably the first or second year I was on the board. I forgot that you were actually already implementing that. I think that's a thing that's a huge success. I've heard from administrators that now that they are forced to capture these incidents, it gives them the foresight to be able to say, oh, this Monica's had this issue multiple times. What do I do with it and how do I address it? I think it's a tool that absolutely they already have in their toolbox to respond to my first big request of you. And I certainly do recognize that some of our schools have truly put amazing practices in place, and we can see that if we disaggregate the data at the school level, that there are schools who are being super successful, but you also, if you talk to them, they are also being really intentional. It's not by chance. They know that they don't want to hear Ms. Johnson-Hosser keep talking to them about their discipline data disparities. So there are our administrators who are really being intentional and using their funding wisely. I mean, we talk about all the time, I always call it local control because the principals are the mayors of their schools. Some of them are truly using their resources wisely, and others probably don't even know it's an opportunity. So that's the onus, I think, on our central service staff is, hey, this is a great thing that this principal here is doing. This might be helpful looking at your school data. So I don't think there's, personally, of course, I can say this because I'm not an administrator, but I think that it would, for me, I would want to know if a school has come up with a strategy that they have found to be useful. The last thing that I do have a question on that we've talked about, but I don't think I've heard directly answered, and that's with ISS is more of a time versus an actual place. How is that distinguished in data? So if I'm an administrator and I'm giving you full examples I know, and I give Monica a timeout, I don't document that, so Monica doesn't show up in your ISS data. Another school Monica's at, Monica gets documented every time she's pulled from class, therefore Monica is in your ISS data. And it certainly changes if it's Monica or Roxy, how the principal or administrator chooses to handle that. Do you all capture, I don't know how you would capture it because you wouldn't know if both of us got sent out of the class, but only one of us is captured in the data.
Well, one thing you just mentioned is the enigma, perhaps, of timeout, which is a different concept, right? And timeout could be for de-escalation issues or things of that sort. And so that is not really captured really in there. You can have timeout as an action, but it's not a reportable per se. So in-school suspension is specifically for disciplinary purposes, right? You have a particular action, an infraction that has been committed, and the state is not completely well-defined in the sense of in-school suspension in the sense of the time, but somewhere it's if they're out of their regularly assigned class for disciplinary purposes for about an hour or more, that is what in-school suspension could look like.
But is it captured? I guess I'm really asking about the documentation.
So in-school suspension is a reportable, so it has to be reported.
And who manages if AP Walker keeps me out of class for 55 minutes versus AP Co keeps me out for an hour and 10 minutes? Who manages that?
Yeah.
Because I can see in a school building, there is no way that I would even remotely think it's possible you could manage day to day and be consistent on something like that.
Yes, it's a school-based responsibility. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I can't imagine. I'm just saying I'm acknowledging that's just not
Right.
easy.
I think it really depends. There are a number of factors, right? De-escalation is not the same for every child. Or understanding or getting to a place where a return to the classroom, they're ready, so to speak. But that's also dependent on the tools and the frame of the adult that's engaging with the student. So there's just a lot of factors. And so I think there is space. There's going to be variation, but there is space for greater articulation and alignment around the mindset and the tools that are used.
I'm also acknowledging, I think, I appreciate that, and I would like to add that to this comprehensive list that we're exploring that and articulating that, and also giving them tools to be able to consistently put these things in place for all students consistently. And because I acknowledge these are human beings, right? If I get a kid out of class and I'm de-escalating, and it's disciplinary, but I may not feel like it's ISS related because this kid needs 2 hours to de-escalate. I walk away to do something else. I may or may not remember how to capture that. So I think it's also difficult because we're asking for humans not to make human errors with something that's a little bit more elusive in how you might be able to capture it. So again, not fault, but more about articulating that this isn't easy, therefore you're going to have almost inherent inconsistencies.
And Ms. Johnson-Hostler, to just add to your point, the thing that I want to say is that's part of the reason why, focusing on that nexus of academic and behavioral health. And remember, behavioral health is not just behavior, it's mental health and social emotional learning. There's a lot of teaching and learning opportunities within those umbrellas, along with the teaching and learning that happens related to academic achievement. And so what we're trying to do, we're saying yes to all that you're saying, and we know that we are not there yet as a district, whether you look at disproportionality or do we have consistent ways to respond anytime like a specific behavior occurs. But that's why we have teams like our behavioral health PLT, or why we're talking with our area superintendents to figure out what the pandemic provides us an opportunity of not kind of going back to where we came from, but now there's these amplified needs from our students that a lot of it is out of our control because of the conditions of the pandemic. But however, when they come into school and we would know more about how important behavioral health is as it relates to teaching and learning, what more can we do? What capacities can we build? What can we focus on? And even in the strategic priority conversations, you all have noted for parents and guardians, for students and staff, that social emotional learning and general like behavioral health elements are a priority area for all of you as board members for our strategic plan. So I think it's us kind of setting those conditions and continuing to not just aspire, but do the work to close the gaps. I don't know how to say this without sounding too like esoteric, but the goal always has to be 100%. We have to go for the 100%, knowing that we may not hit that, but that's what we have to keep going for so that we close gaps little by little over time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Mr. Haggerty?
Thank you. A lot of great topics, a lot of things that have been discussed. I do want to amplify where Ms. Johnson-Hostler was going in terms of short-term suspensions, because I hear a lot from parents about inconsistencies from school to school around ISS. I've had situations where a parent might be told there is no ISS in their school, but the student has been removed from class, and sometimes several times. And so like you said, is that a difference between a timeout, a de-escalation, or is it a real disciplinary action that's been taken against the child? How do you document it? How do you track it? Is there any way we can look at some sort of alignment from school to school that gives staff the flexibility to address specific situations, but then also lets us as a district be able to identify how often this technique is used and how often kids are being removed from class. So that would be my first statement, just to add on to what's been said. Related to that, and I'm going to ask this as a question, is there any sort of notification to parents when a child is removed from class? Is there supposed to be a documentation or notification? And it's a loaded question because I've heard situations where a student is recommended for a longer-term suspension, out-of-school suspension, or maybe a 10-day suspension, and some of the rationale they're given has been numerous in-school suspensions that the parent doesn't know anything about.
Yes. I mean, especially if it's out of school suspension, Mr. Haggerty, right? There is due process where you have to get the student to respond to charges, and due process isn't really complete until you hand them the suspension form. And so that has to be quite strong in our district with that. And so in our policy as well, we do have policy 4309, the Code of Student Conduct, when it talks about the last time that we did a revision, we put in a section with feedback from many of you about notification to parents, and it does clarify that when a significant behavioral intervention beyond mere redirection or a warning is imposed, the school will attempt to notify the parent or legal guardian in a reasonably prompt manner. And that can look like that it's in the particular system and that an incident is created, but yes, they are to be notified, and that is policy. That communication's key.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think that's an important clarification. You know, sometimes there's different behaviors that will be managed different ways. If a parent is called and is simply told, your child's having a bad day, would you like to pick them up?
No.
You know, is that viewed as sending the child home, or is that
That's an
is that
out-of-school
not?
suspension.
Okay.
If you call and you let a parent know that it's a disciplinary issue happening, and would you like to pick them up, then, yeah, that's problematic.
Okay, thank you. I think these are just important things to get more clarity
Yes.
around and make sure that we're being as consistent and aligned around the district as we can. Two other things that I wanted to get back to. I wanted to also go back to a point Dr. Martin was making, and it's a concern that I had too, which is as we look at longer-term suspensions, really all suspensions, but long-term suspensions in particular, you know, without knowing more of the context behind the suspension, the reasons for it, I know that we'd like to reduce all of these numbers to the absolute minimum, but I also know that in some cases we have less discretion, right? There are state and federal laws, the Gun-Free Schools Act, there's a statute we were looking at as we were looking at the budget code about long-term suspensions that mandate 365-day suspensions for gun possession. And so being able to break down this data and see, was a suspension given because we were, obligated, mandated by state law, or was it something at the discretionary of the administration? I think that would give us a better idea maybe of some of the margins where, maybe we had more freedom to investigate and maybe arrive at an alternative solution. Another area of data, in addition to maybe what was the cause of the suspension, if you can track it, I would love to know that when you have disciplinary referrals where a suspension has been recommended, how many cases have there been where, a student or a family was represented by legal counsel or was represented by a navigator or parent advocate versus when they were not, and differences in the outcome? I think that's something that has been very telling. It's something we see in the criminal justice system in terms of representation, knowledge of rights, and if similar cases are still producing similar outcomes, or if that's a real determinant factor. And then finally, I guess the last thing, and this shifts again a bit, I really appreciate you including the suspension reports and the background data. I know that 2020, 2021, for all the reasons we've talked about, is an atypical year. As I look at the data, though, what I see, and I just want to make sure I'm reading this right, I see we've had a tremendous drop in the number of short-term suspensions, which makes sense because there were fewer students in school. I see, according to your chart, 642 short-term suspensions versus previous years where you might have 7,000, 9,000, 12,000 short-term suspensions. But then when I look over at long-term suspensions and expulsions, I see 2 long-term suspensions, 1 expulsion during the most recent year. And then as I go to previous years, I see 3 long-term suspensions, 1 expulsion, 3 long-term suspensions, 3 expulsions, 4 long-term, 0 expulsions. So it sounds like that number of the long-term suspensions and expulsions, as I look back over the 5 years, is staying pretty consistent. Am I reading that correctly, or is that just a trick of the numbers?
Yeah, no trick. Yeah, you are absolutely right. Yeah, we have averaged over the past 4 or 5 years about 2-3 long-term suspensions, as well as expulsions are rare in the sense of that. So that is true.
If I could provide a little context for that, the rationale behind that really is the district, through the direction of the board and changes in policy, ensuring that there are opportunities, greater opportunities for students who are recommended for long-term suspension to instead have an opportunity for an alternative model to continue gaining credits or progress towards graduation or grade level. So you're going to see very few of those, period, and those numbers wouldn't change much regardless of the circumstances because they're being redirected. What might be an interesting thing to look at is what do those numbers look like prior to the redirection?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Kushner, and then we're going to go back for a round of second questions.
Thank you, Chair Mahaffey, and I appreciate the great conversation from colleagues and lifting up some very important priorities. I think as a board, we've tried to make very clear in the last few years around de-escalation, around focusing on keeping kids in school. And I think we need to also point back to the elementary level suspensions as a great concern when we have at an elementary level, we don't have ALCs, we don't seem to have consistent in-school suspension places. There is, confusion when a principal calls or a teacher, do you want to come pick up your child? They're having a bad day, and that equates to a kindergartner being listed as being out of school suspension. I think that's something we've talked about as a board to try to work with some intentionality, as Ms. Johnson-Hostler would say, around keeping elementary schools students in particular in school and working with our behavioral supports to make sure that we are stopping that before it gets to the middle and high school and may become more of a pattern, if that makes sense. I mean, I just wanted to make sure we looked again at that elementary level data in particular.
Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. Ms. Waters?
Thank you. And Ms. Johnson-Hostler really said a lot of the things that I wish I had the words to articulate, so I appreciate all that she said. And one of the things she mentioned was the crisis from home. And as we really think about the impact of the pandemic, particularly on Black and Brown communities, the disparate impact, and also for children with special needs, and as we think about the crisis from the home, it makes me concerned in terms of discipline as we see many of our students who are facing very real problems, food insecurity, issues like evictions that are really real and growing at this time. And as we look to make progress, I just wonder what part of the process is engaging with the parents, and how does that look? Are there intentional steps to work with families who are experiencing these crises so that there is a way to kind of head off some of the issues that are crisis in the home that lead to suspension? Are there any focus groups, or how is engagement with parents looking through this process so that we kind of get the information from the parents so that we know what issues the children are facing, and is there a way to kind of get feedback from Black and Brown families who are disproportionately impacted by suspensions to get more information, input, and look at resources and steps that can address this from a lens. And I appreciate that you said I'm looking from a broader lens, but really looking kind of grassroots from the parent level, from the parent perspective, and including them in the conversation, because I love kind of the school's perspective, and I think that was really powerful to hear from the schools, but I think it's very powerful to hear from the community and from the parent perspective as well, and what does that look like, and is that a part of the process, and if not, is there a way to build that in?
Thank you, Ms. Waters, for that question. I think the parent-family engagement is something that we're always seeking to continually improve on. And I think some of the examples that our school-based folks gave, Ms. Hutchinson at Centennial talked about how building relationships with students also involves building relationships with the families before problems occur, like, for proactive, evening gatherings or community events at the school. I think similarly to what Dr. Chavis mentioned about one of the prongs to implement the culturally responsive framework is the family-parent engagement, so that we're hearing from the community. So I think there are some specific tenets that we're going by, and now to Ms. Johnson-Hostler's point, how do we scale that up so that it is more consistent and broad and regular practice is something that I think we are continually building towards. And with that said, I think it's important to note that a lot of our schools during the pandemic, before the pandemic, have continually attempt over and over again every year to try to figure out how to connect with families, and particularly some of our most vulnerable families. And, even though, again, it's not at 100% success, they're going to keep trying, and that's why, work with our social workers, our counselors, our student support services team is a key lever at the school to make sure that we're connecting with families as best as we can. So that's kind of like a general way of the things we have to work with, but to, I guess, be strategic across our system for all 160,000, 197 schools. It's something that we're still going to be working on and working towards. And hopefully the next time we come to the table, we're able to share some additional success and more scaled up strategies.
Thank you. Dr. Martin and then Ms. Scott.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the point that Mr. Haggerty and Ms. Kushner brought up. And we talked about it before, multiple times before, as you noted, and that is, right, if a kid's having a bad day, call home, say, hey, we want to come pick up the kid, that's classified as a suspension. And that, when we looked at it, was one of the major causes of suspensions at elementary school level. I agree that, right, to not track some of that information can be problematic, particularly if we're going to look for demographic issues. But to put a suspension on a child's record in elementary school because they're having a bad day and you called home to say, hey, pick up your kid, that's problematic. So I guess the specific question I have is, what would it take to change that classification? I believe it's a classification that's required at the state level. If so, can we find out for sure? And then maybe it needs to be part of a legislative agenda. Maybe it just needs to go to DPI. How specifically would we address that? Because you're having a rough day, you want to pick up your kid, should not be on a child's record as a suspension. It should be a de-escalation tool, yeah.
So if a school calls and informs the parent of the behavior and what the day looked like as information and leaves it at that, and the parent then says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and come pick up Johnny, that is not an out-of-school suspension.
But that's a nuance. That's a nuance of vocabulary, right?
I could chime in on that. I mean, I think if it is an exclusion, like bad day, and I'm imposing discipline, pick up your child, it is out-of-school suspension, would have to be coded as such. If it's Johnny's in the office and we're going to have to keep him here because he's misbehaving, and so if you wish instead to pick him up, that's your choice. Otherwise, he'll be here. Then that's an in-school essentially thing. It's not an out-of-school suspension. It's a voluntary choice on the part of the parent.
But that's very subtle language for our administrators, and what is heard by the parent is not necessarily what is being communicated. And so, I mean, we know that there is some of this stuff that's going on.
Yeah, we'll continue, and it's not a new topic, right? And thank you. This has been years of I say my team is a chorus, right? Not even a broken record. We continually clarify that, and in any particular instance that we're aware of, we really try to remedy it. But thank you, because we want to make sure that we respond accordingly. Yeah.
Ms. Scott, and then Ms. Carter, and then Ms. Cash.
Thank you. A lot of gratitude to my colleagues for the questions and remarks, and toward improving outcomes for our students, outcomes for our families, outcomes for our future. And one of the pieces that I think Ms. Johnson-Hostler touched on with educators, with supporting educators in the classroom, I was thinking about when I've only glanced in the abstract at the teacher working conditions surveys and wondered if some of the answers to where some students had reported that they did not feel as much support from administration at their schools, if any of those did have to do with not feeling supported or not understanding how to help de-escalate or manage discipline concerns with students. Because some schools had a really, it was a shocking number to see. And I just wondered if that is also part of this piece, part of this work of making sure that we are providing the supports that educators need, the tools that they need to support their students and support their classrooms.
Yes, Ms. Scott, the simple answer is yes. We want our administrators and our teachers and all the staff in a school building to support the success of our students. And I think alignment, the more that we improve the alignment between where role clarity is and what are disciplinary incidents that require out of classroom intervention, or which disciplinary moments require out of school suspensions and so on. I think there's clarity there, and we do annual trainings based on policy through our due process office, but I think there is professional learning and development that's also going to help kind of bridge those gaps that you're talking about. That is also something that we've talked with our area superintendents and school leadership meeting planners about, is like what are the priorities across this year that we need to really focus on. And so I appreciate that suggestion, and I think the suggestion of looking at the teacher work condition survey data as another indicator for us to review more thoroughly, specific to that question, I think would be really helpful.
I appreciate that. I was, even thinking at some of our schools that are not identified as Title I, that are sort of right there, but they're not, who may or may not have had a social worker, because we are facing staffing, crisis as everyone is, and who maybe even could use a second social worker, but they might not have anyone in place for that. But then also, because they're not identified as Title I, they might not have a family coordinators assisting from central services. So it's just, it's certainly a lot. But thank you for that.
Ms. Carter and then Ms. Cash.
I just had a question. I was just curious about notification. I know you said it's required. Is there any specific requirements, such as a phone call just saying, come pick up your child? Is that assumed that the parent understands that's considered? I just want to be, or is it a paper notification or an email notification, or does it vary based upon the school?
So notification can vary depending on the particular, if it's again, it says this idea of beyond mere redirection or warning will attempt to notify. We have clear aspects of an OSS. An in-school suspension, also an incident, should be created, which provides notice. Things like after-school detention, lunch detention, that may vary, Ms. Carter, depending on the school, what that looks like.
So what would it take to have a standard expectation for the entire district, so that some parents who are not always clear that this is happening in some schools versus some that may always know? I'm just trying to, I know we look for, allowing schools to have some flexibility, but at the same time, due to the concern about lack of some folks understanding what's occurring, I think this is something important to have very clear expectations, so that all families, no matter what school they attend in our district, have a clear expectation about what they should be seeing if something is happening.
I'm just going to say that I think that's some follow-up work, because I believe the answer probably resides in the 195 schools, with those that are already have some practices in place and how those are working, and that's a place where they best learn from each other. But I think we have to prompt the conversation through some area meetings or level PLT meetings to determine how they are providing these types of notifications. That helps us understand, in looking at policy, how we are adhering to policy, advancing policy, whether changes need to be made through policy or not through policy, perhaps through R&P, and how we provide those tools to schools to make sure that that's happening. But I think we start with gathering what's happening already.
Thank you.
Ms. Cash.
So we know that COVID caused a lack of socialization for most of our children, and a lot of family stressors. People lost their jobs, and a lot of them lost their businesses. So there's a lot going on in the world of a child during that time. And I don't think we know this, but I was wondering if somewhere in the future we would know possibly what grade levels were most impacted by this in their learning and their like behavior. I mean, I'm going to be curious to know whether middle schoolers were impacted mostly by that. I mean, healthcare has come up with an idea of what they think, but because I'm hearing so much from our K-2 teachers, of course, and K-1 especially, because there's been no socialization for most of those students, if any. Some never have had it, and some didn't get it for a couple years. And if we're not looking at the interventions that are happening in those classrooms and the loss of learning that's going to happen, I'm wondering if we're missing a good predictor. I mean, there are a lot of K-1 students that I think are getting a lot of interventions, and teachers aren't probably having time to possibly write those, indicate those. So I'm really worried. I'm always worried about our K-3 learners and our cradle to kindergarten environment of our students, but I'm worried that these kids post-COVID in K-2 there's a lot of predictors there that we might not be measuring right now.
I think those are all valid points. I will just say that this data is not currently, and in previous years, I'm not sure to what extent, we've disaggregated by grade level as well. It's not like how many kids are we even talking about here. I think that's something that we've got to take a look at to see, because whether the universe is large or small, when you start digging in, what you do, it may be different, but still important. If it's not very many students, that might be good news, but what an opportunity to really change trajectory, because it's not that many kids. It's a larger group. If it's a larger number than we think it should be, that gives us a little bit of a different indication about what's happening and how we might need to address through training or policy or culture or any of those things. But I think we need to go back and take a look at how many, because the data you've gotten today doesn't include any of that disaggregation by grade level or a level or category 1, 2, or 3 even, those kinds of things. So going back and taking a look at all of that, because if most of the suspensions are in areas where they're not about the typical things that I think things like non-compliance and language and that sort of thing have pretty much gone away. But then what is left in level 2 that might be an issue, or are they all level 3 mostly? I think we don't have that information right now.
Well, and with the lack of staff that we have, and I know kindergarten and first grade, they're trying to teach them to read and socialize them at the same time. And I think our lack of IAs, sometimes teacher or TAs, whatever the proper word is now, the lack of staff is affecting those grade levels. So I just want to be sure that we're supporting them so that we don't have some problems in the future.
And Ms. Cash, to add to what Superintendent Moore said, and thank you for your point, one of the pieces of work that we've been doing through our behavioral health work is to also measure data that are our behavioral health indicators that are based on Maslow's hierarchy, that are like love and belonging. To what degree do we have chronic absenteeism issues, right, at our schools? And I think it's really trying to intersect the discipline data that we've presented today, but with all the other data available to us, and go, if we have X number of students who've been suspended, how many are experiencing housing transition? How many experienced chronic absenteeism at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year? How many have behavior support plans, right? And trying to make sure that and that's what we mean by the point around like expanding our data review and our data practice, is to the discipline data. It's one of the most intense indicators of like challenges with students. Like all this crazy stuff happened, and now we have to do this really hard thing and exclude a student. But if we also look and understand the story through data points of what is going on with the student, then we're better able to say that happened because of these reasons. And next time around, maybe we can proactively help the student de-escalate, check in with someone, understanding that they're going through housing transitions, right? And I think all of those things are part of what we're trying to do in alignment with what you all have discussed in the strategic plan as well.
I appreciate that. I think that you're looking at the predictors, and I think that's what we can do best. Thank you.
And I think that segues into my one question, which I saved until the end because I didn't expect any answers today, but thought if there's a follow-up of Section 4, whether it's in student achievement or another work session, the one question I had that didn't get answered was specifically surrounding our special education students that get suspended, and especially when there are multiple suspensions involved. What does it mean when someone with an IEP gets suspended, especially when it's multiple times? What are those points? Because I know multiple interventions go into that student before they're given an in-school and especially an out-of-school suspension. And then is there a certain point where if that student doesn't have a behavior intervention plan, they are recommended for a behavior intervention plan to deal with the issues that are being seen at school? And then, as you had mentioned, Mr. Coe, my next question was, how many of these students do have a behavior intervention plan? So I'm going to end on that note because I know there are no answers to that at this time, but as we continue to disaggregate this data and learn more about what we can do to make school a place where students are in and learning more often than not, I certainly appreciate both of your work on this and in listening to these questions and answering them as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes before we move to our regular meeting. So we'll take a break so folks can set up, and we'll be back here at 5:30-ish.